I want to say that it's an honor to be here. About a year and a half ago, I spoke at Holy Cross College in Worcester, and it reminded me of my youth when I had I wouldn't say an obsession, but a very deep interest in who Catholics are and what they believe and what they don't believe. And I think I want to begin by addressing the disgrace that the press has now placed the Catholic Church into. There have been bad priests and there have been bad rabbis, and none of them do us any good. But the integrity of the religion, in my understanding of it, is never in question. I think we're going to be okay because the Protestant sociologist Mary Eberhardt has said that the people going to church today are, contrary to what you would think, educated America. That's who's going to church. People with degrees and graduate degrees. It's a very surprising but very sound statistic. And those people can distinguish, between night and day. And I think at some level, and I say this with reverence and with care, I think the church is going to come out of this and be okay. Now, that's not a patronizing comment. That's kind of the point that I want to be clear about. But it seems to me, you're going to come out ahead, you're going to come out okay, because we have more educated people in the world today than ever before, and if education does nothing else, it helps us see the forest from the trees. And we can distinguish between darkness and light, and the profane and the holy. And we know who is profane and who is not profane. And more than anything else, we know what the church wants. So I'm here as a friend and as a supporter. And I think I agreed to this tonight in some measure because I love to talk about Elie, but also because with the greatest deference and respect on my part, I think the church needs support. And I'm here to provide some of that. That's all. So I'm sitting. How much time do I have? 45 minutes? Okay. How many? 45 minutes. Okay. That's fine. I could tell jokes for the rest of the time. I'm sitting in this lady's living room in Jerusalem, American woman, real Jewish religious aristocracy from New York, lives in a palace, and we're talking. She heard I was in Jerusalem. Somebody gave her my book. She read my book. Oh, you're Dutch? Well, I'm Dutch too. And the Holocaust, okay, good. We had this conversation. And then she says to me, do you know a woman by the name of Judith Hemendinger? Hemendinger. Hemmendinger. I said, no, I don't know who that is. So she says, if I give you a book, will you read it? I said, if you read my book, I'll read your book. So I read the book, and who in God's name was Judith Hemmendinger? So it's like this. In my life, I got out of the camps in 1945. And I was separated from my mother and my father. My father was murdered by the Nazis. He died of hunger and malnutrition. And we were on a train out of Bergen-Belsen, the notorious concentration camp, Bergen-Belsen, northern Germany. We were taken on a train a week before liberation by the British and the Canadians liberated Bergen-Belsen. We are taken. The entire, there's a camp, a Jewish camp within Bergen-Belsen. And this Jewish camp is made up of people who had good passports, had spectacular human skills of doctors, lawyers, and we were supposed to be really good material for prisoner exchange because the war was coming to an end. So here you have a camp of 8,000 people, and if you were going to be sent to a concentration camp, then Bergen-Belsen was the Hilton, as it was called, of the concentration camps. There was food, there was water, and you wore your own clothing. There was no camp garb. And if you wore your own clothing, and you brought it from wherever you came from, what was on your clothing? Star. So that's why the camp, the Jewish camp in Bergen-Belsen, was called the Star Camp, the Sternlager. And the Star Camp, so we're in the Star Camp, and the Star Camp they decide to empty May 6th, 7th, and 9th, 1945. 3 trains. For the first train, all of them going to Theresienstadt, another camp filled with people like us. But that was already a nasty place. Bergen-Belsen was not a nasty place until, I've got to get this right, until December 1944. What's going on in December 1944? All of this is in a way of telling you about Mrs. Hemmendinger. You understand? The story in December 1944 is that the Germans are finally clued in that they're losing the war. So they have to make the evidence of their atrocities disappear. And they have to empty all the really bad places. So all the really bad places are emptied out by what time of year is December? December 44. All the major concentration camps, Auschwitz, everybody is emptied and sent by foot to Bergen-Belsen. Some other camps as well, but major Bergen-Belsen. So that a camp in December 44 that is built for 8,000 to 10,000 people suddenly, within 3, 4, 5 weeks, has 40,000 people in it, with no increase in food, no increase in water, and far more important, we're among grown-ups here, no toilets, no increase in sanitation. So 40,000 people have to go, and there's nowhere to go. There are lines. What you get in that setting is something called typhus. Your bowels are out of control. and you can't wait. Okay, you got the picture? So by December 44, the greatest hell on earth was Bergen-Belsen. So finally, in December, in April, as I said, April 6th, 7th, and 9th, the Star Camp is emptied. They're sending the people on three successive trains to Theresienstadt, which is they're going pretty much due south from northern Germany to Czechoslovakia, to Prague, to the suburbs where Theresienstadt is. The first train actually makes it, no. The first train is liberated by the Americans near Berlin. The second train makes it to Theresienstadt. Second train is filled largely with Hungarian Jews. The third train, so to speak, drops off the face of the earth. And 3 years ago, a major historian of the Holocaust wrote about the last days of Bergen-Belsen at Yad Vashem in Israel, and she says in her book, and no one knows what happened to the third train. Hello. I was on the third train with my mother and with my father still alive. The train is liberated far, almost at the, so what's happening is the train from Bergen-Belsen is looking for tracks due south, but everything's been bombed. So it's going ziggity-zaggity, ziggity-zaggity, looking for corridors to get south. And the train is stopped almost at the Polish border at a lovely little village on a lake called Trobitz, where there never was a Jew, never lived a Jew. Weird, but that's what happened. And our train is liberated by the greatest friends Jews ever had, the Cossacks. And the Cossacks liberate our trains, go into the town, rape every German woman they can find, which was what they did, threw everybody out of their houses, and said, Jews, the houses are yours, stay here as long as you need to, and they started bringing in medical help. My father died in Trebitz of typhus and of malnutrition. My mother had a sign that she kept in her drawer to her death when she was much older, which said, about to die. She was very proud of that sign. She said, rumors of my are premature. But she did not, she was off her rocker with, what do you call it when you have high fever? Delirium. Oh, terrible. I didn't, her voice, she was a soprano and she became a bass. Talked like this. And I don't remember because I was 2.5. I remember some things, but not enough. But I knew I was terrified. And I was taken with an American group of soldiers who were a trucking company, an American military trucking company in Germany. Pardon me? Transportation, yes. Taken to a German city nearby, Leipzig. And Leipzig, I was sent back to Holland, and there I was adopted by a family for a short period of time. My memory is perfectly fine from the getting on that train in Leipzig. It's sound, and my book is about that. What I want to tell you about is that we came back to Holland. We were there for 3 or 4 years. There was no future for Jews in Holland. Every Jew who knew that. First, you have to hear the numbers. The numbers are that before the war, Holland had 135,000 Jews. In May, the end of May, June 1945, under 35,000 survived. That's the highest percentage in all of Western Europe. In all of Europe, it's the second highest percentage. The highest percentage, believe it or not, percentage, not numbers, is Greece. Greece got really hit badly, and they were largely, Salonika wasn't completely wiped out. But Holland came a close second, and the Jews came there. And I want to talk about Elie, but it was obscene what happened there. People came back to Holland, the 35,000, paltry Jews with nothing and families gone. And they registered and they got some homes. All their homes were taken, right? With other people living there. Where's my furniture? Oh, where's your furniture? And the Dutch government got their address. Dutch is a liberal, fine, good government, and sent everybody who came back from the camps their tax bills for the last 3 years. Almost immediately. You then went, you went to the insurance company and say, where the heck's my furniture? Well, do you have a policy? Well, of course I have a policy with you. I look up the policy, and they say, well, you really do have a policy with us, but you haven't paid your premiums for the last 3 years. So you scratch your head and say, oh, that's what I forgot to bring to Bergen-Belsen. My checkbook, right? And my envelopes. Yeah, and you can be sure that I got my mail forwarded to Bergen-Belsen. Okay. In Holland, I went to kindergarten. Must have also some pre-kindergarten must have been. So I was 3 and 4 and 5. Into my 5th birthday. I went to school there, and I lived in a house with mother of Holocaust survivors. Jewish community organized something, got a lovely mansion, which I remember, and which I went back to visit when I was writing the book. And I'm in the mansion, and I remember everything. And it was a great experience, except that they were all crazy. They were off their heads from what happened to them. And no one talked about anything. And I then moved with my mother to Montreal. We had family there. And grew up there. And no one ever spoke about the Holocaust. I went almost as soon as I got there. Mother got me a tutor, taught me to read Hebrew, and said, you're going to synagogue to say Kaddish for your father. I go to synagogue, I'm a kid, 6 years old, is coming to synagogue, saying Kaddish for his father. What would you think somebody would ask me? Where's your father? No one. Nothing. Nothing. Okay. So you understand this, and this is my entryway into, I have a photograph of my grade 7 class. I sat and looked at it with my high school principal, who's now 95. I sat in Montreal in his house, and we looked at the picture, and he said, this one is a survivor, this one is a survivor, this one. 7 out of a class of about 15 were child survivors. I didn't know. We never talked about it. Never talked about it. Elie has a different story. Elie comes out of, what camp was he in? No, he was Auschwitz first, and then he was in Buchenwald. Elie comes out of Buchenwald with 600 other kids. The boys of Buchenwald, mostly boys. And they brought them to Paris. Elie is 16, 15, 16, and most of the kids were that old or younger. France, throughout the war, although it sent 75,000 Jews to their deaths, the percentage of Jews that survived in France was over 50%. The percentage of children that survived in France, get ready for this, the highest, I think, anywhere, 86.7%. Why? Because the Jewish community was organized, because they had safety houses up and down the south and the north. They had a fabulous organization. And so also, when the boys of Buchenwald, as they were called, came out, it was not a dumb decision to bring them to Paris. And Elie is part of that group. And guess what? By the time they got to Paris, a school was ready to go for these boys. So I'm sitting, Elie and I he was my best friend, though not my closest friend. You understand? There was a tremendous bond between us, and every week, on the days that he came to BU, we would take an hour and a half and study Torah together. That's what we did. That was the relationship. And I provided the texts, and he provided the commentary, and we both provided the jokes, and it was a wonderful relationship. And I once made the mistake of saying to Elie gave, in those years, 3 public lectures every year at Boston University. Some of you probably went to some of those. And he would give them on a biblical figure or a Hasidic master or some problem. And they were packed, 1,200 people, reliably, many of them students. I was always happy about that part. And I said to him, we got into talking, does Elie Wiesel talk about the Holocaust? He said, me? He says, that's not my topic. And I could never persuade him that that's all he talked about. But it's true. It's true. That's all he talked about. And even as we are studying together sacred texts, that's all we talked about. That's all we talked about the Holocaust. Never directly, but always in the text, you know. Yeah, so what about this God, Polak? What about him? You know, what about this God? And Elie, so he is in Paris. And he tells me, no, and she writes about it, but he told me about it. It's the first day of school in Paris. He is an 18-year-old kid, very smart, with eyes that you could not look the other way, or you had to look the other way, depending on who you were. He tried to get Francois Mauriac to help sell his book or give an introduction, and Francois wrote about the eyes, the Elie Wiesel eyes. And he says, we go into class, and there is this woman in her late 20s or early 30s, and she is going to teach me. And he says, we glared at her. You have something to teach us? Do you know where we have been? Do you know what we have seen? What do you have? What could you possibly have to teach me? You have some nerve, lady, walking into this room. And they were so profoundly resentful of her. We have learned, lady, everything that life has to teach. We know what man can do to man. What are you going to tell us about love? What are you going to tell us about honor? What are you going to tell us? To observe the Sabbath and keep it holy? Enough of that stuff. We've seen where it takes you. So this poor lady is Judith Hemmendinger. And she writes, she's not a writer, but she writes, on April 11th, 1945, the American troops arrived at Buchenwald. When these war-hardened men who had been prepared to die and kill set their eyes on the largest place of death in the world, they were petrified and shocked. Thousands of weak men heaped together in cots were just waiting to join the piles of skeletons outside. Elie told me that what he could not get used to for months in Paris was the fact that there were no corpses everywhere. The soldiers went from barracks to barracks until they reached number 66. What they saw there struck them with horror. Hundreds of skeleton-like children, all boys, silently looking at them with huge, deeply set eyes, their faces resembling those of old men. They were Hungarian and Polish children, ranging in age from 8 to 20. The commander of the American troops was totally bewildered and sent a cable to the OSE in Geneva. The OSE is Œuvre de Secours des Enfants, the organization in France that I told you took care of children. Have found 1,000 Jewish children in Buchenwald, take immediate measures to evacuate them. At that time, she writes, I was a refugee in Geneva working at the OSE and made efforts to obtain visas for the children. 280 visas were issued in Switzerland, 480 by France, 250 by England. Children would be leaving Buchenwald in June. Meantime, the American troops provided for the youngest, the most urgent for the youngsters the most urgent needs, food and clothing. All of the children wore dreadful striped pajamas, which were too large in most cases, but by a horrible twist of fate, the only replacements of clothing for that the Americans could find were the uniforms of the Hitler Youth. The soldiers overdid their kindness and stuffed the youngsters with what? You're on the right track. With oversized cans of food, sweets, chewing gum, and consequently many of the children died of overeating. Typhus swept through the camp, and the only remedy was to cover the poor little fever-burning bodies with constantly renewed fresh sheets. These children had lived through the very deepest misery that one could imagine. They were taken first to Auschwitz, where they had been treated like adults. They rose between 4 and 5 in the morning and were given 30 minutes to wash. Each barracks only had a few faucets and to straighten up their cots. Next came roll call. And so I'm not going to read the whole thing. They were not allowed to rest at all during the day, and so on and so forth. The children of Barrack 66 were quick to adapt to life in the camp. Their ability to adapt greatly contributed to their survival. The youngest children reacted best because they realized that united they were strong. In many cases, they helped their elders, supporting them and taking over responsibilities. That's what Elie did. That's what Elie did in the camp. The children who, upon their arrival, were placed in the same group as their brothers and cousins, made every possible effort not to be separated from them, neither in the barracks nor during work. Those without parents in the camp searched for a comrade, a companion, and that's how you survived. Children who came to France were the survivors of this genocide. Surprisingly, not a single act of vengeance was committed against German civilians during their brief stay in Germany. The children told us that many prisoners went to German houses and asked for food. One of them asked for a violin to play Hungarian music, another for a camera to take pictures of Buchenwald. Some of the younger people stole chickens in Weimar. Others stole bicycles or motorcycles. To them, this was not theft. They considered it their due, a sort of compensation. So he is brought to Paris, and he is the one. He is the one that doesn't let it go. He is the one that doesn't let it go. He's in this room, as I said, on this first day, looking at Judith. Say, you are going to teach me. I mean, I told you about that. And he writes the introduction for her book. And it's like not the most mature thing he ever wrote. Listen. Dear Judith. Now, whoever writes an introduction to a book, starting with Dear Judith. He didn't write that in my book. He wrote an introduction. I read your book. I remember. I returned to 1945. Écuyer, Ambloy, Taverny, the dumbfounded instructors, the disoriented children. Did you know that to us you belonged to another universe? Everything separated us, the language, the physical surroundings, and above all, the memories. Did you know, Judith, that we pitied you? You made us pity you. You thought you could educate us And yet the youngest among us knew more than you, of the value of things, of the futility of life, and the brutal triumph of death. A friend of mine, no longer alive, you know who this is? What's the name of the guy who owns the Patriots? Kraft's brother was a rabbi, and I knew him. He was the Hillel rabbi at one of the New York, Queens, I think, one of the New York schools. Yeah. And Kraft was a GI that liberated one of the camps. And he told me he was a GI, was probably a chaplain of some kind. And Kraft told me that that he went into one of the camps, and then he left the camp and got toys. And he brought the kids toys to play with, the ones that he found in the camp. And he says, not a single kid wanted a toy. And he said to them, don't you want to play a little bit? And the kid said to him, schon genug gespielt, which means, I played enough already. Kids in Auschwitz, the 10-year-olds, the 11-year-olds, had gray hair. They had old faces. And Elie is the one who couldn't let it go. But in my world, what I told you was that no one talked about it. No one talked about it. No one asked me who I was saying Kaddish for. No one asked me what happened to my father. And even if I could answer, I could say he's dead. I didn't know what dead meant. What do you know from dead? From when you're 8? Well, you don't know. But he, you see, wouldn't let it go. And the world, and particularly the survivors, for the most part, had no capacity to mourn. You can mourn for one person. You can mourn for 2 people. But you can't mourn for 6 million. What's the name? My friend, it's a Catholic priest, a former Catholic priest, James Carroll. James Carroll calls me up. We were chaplains together at Boston University in the early days. Jim calls me up, and he says that he just went to a bar mitzvah. He says, when I go to the Irish breakfast, St. Patrick's Day breakfast, he says, it's a lot of jokes, he says, and it's a happy time. He says, but we're not connected. He says, when I go to a bar mitzvah, no matter how stupidly lavish, he says, people are all family. They're all family. And you have to understand that about the Jewish people. To understand that. And he told me he was jealous of the Jewish people for that. And this family cannot mourn its own because it can't even talk about it. The Mishnah, which is a 3rd century legal text that Jews still study to this day and live by, Mishnah talks about a particular law of a group of women, and the context is, are they permitted to do this on a Jewish holiday? The women would come to funerals and to memorial services, and with their instruments and with their song they were called the mitonanim. And the mitonanim were professional make-you-criers. And the question was, were they permitted to do this if somebody lost somebody on a festival? What was more important, the joy of the festival or the proper mourning? But you see that we do not have a natural ability to mourn. Somebody's got to take us there. Somebody's got to take us there. And Christians have wakes where it's not done properly anymore. I forgot what it's for. And Jews have Shiva. But to get you to mourn, most people need to be taken there and feel that darn grief. And I'm telling you that through my entire childhood and my adolescence and my young adult life, no one got me to mourn until I read Night. And that's what he did. That's what he did. He took the 250,000 survivors and he said, we got to talk about this for what it is. And as we're talking about this, brothers and sisters, we also got to talk about God. Is he mourning? Is he mourning? Is he feeling what we are not letting ourselves feel? Does he sit and cry for his lost Jews? 1,000 kids in a barracks? 1,000 kids in a barracks looking like skeletons? Was he with us in those barracks? How could he be there? How could he sit with us? And as he would like to say, and how could he not sit with us? Elie Wiesel was the enabler for the whole world, you see, to mourn. And to start feeling the grief by talking about its range in the world of feelings, not in the world of numbers. That wasn't his job. He was the founder of the Holocaust Museum in Washington. He hated committee meetings. He sat through those committee meetings and planned about it and thought about it and thought about it. And he was the one, really, that started to articulate in this book that he wrote. He wrote the book, he published it in 1961. He was writing it throughout the 50s. He wrote it in Yiddish. And eventually he had it translated. And he had it translated, and of course, I think it sold 1,000 copies of the first run. I think my book even sold more than that in the first run. And then he sold the rights to his publisher. Yeah. So that for 25 years, when millions of copies were being sold, he didn't get a nickel for a night. Fortunately, he married a smart and a good woman. And Marion got an idea, and she retranslated the whole book. And said, this is a new edition. And that solved some of the economic concerns. Part of the problem that he faced in articulating a kind of epitaph for the 6 million and a cry to mourn it was that mourning, as you know, is in stages. And as the mourner, feels less and less the devastation of his and her loss, as that goes away, you are ready to engage in a new kind of mourning. That you weren't mature enough earlier in the process. And what happens with the Holocaust is peculiar because it never leaves you. Holocaust does not go away. I just heard about a survivor who died, who had a secret Hanukkah menorah that he made in one of the camps. A tiny little thing that he made. And when he died, he asked that it be buried with him. It doesn't go away. You have to really understand that when you see survivors. It's always 6 inches away. It's not a mile away. It's always 6 inches away. And what you have begun to understand about humanity by being in those camps it's not forgettable. So 30 countries in the early 40s or the late 30s, I forget which, met in France, in Evian, where the water's from. They met in Evian, and the purpose of the meeting, I think it was organized by the League of Nations, purpose of the meeting was for each country to say how many people, how many Jews they would take in. Not a single country, in the end, took one. The historian of the story of Canada during the Holocaust, a guy at the University of Toronto, entitled his book by what the Canadian Prime Minister had said about accepting Jews, quote unquote, this is his title, "One is too many." We had, this is what I'm going to tell you. I'm part of what I do at Boston University as I work with in the area of medical ethics. And part of my work with medical ethics is to talk about medicine during the Holocaust, and I'll tell you a thing or two about it. But the reason that I bring it up is that one of the colleagues that I work with decided to organize a conference on medicine during the Holocaust. And my job was to bring Elie to speak to the conference. Elie did not want to speak in the conference in the worst way. But he and I had a deal. Deal was, I don't say no to you, you don't say no to me. So he kept saying he's not coming. And I'm not dumb enough to pull out the deal and say that, okay? But the doctors are all sitting in a small conference auditorium at Boston University, and I go to his office and I say, you're coming with me to say a word, just say hello, don't have to say anything. So, okay, I knew he would come. So I deliver him to the conference, it's about a room about the size of this, with this many people, and he walks in and there's a hush. And he gets up in front of the group, completely unprepared. And he says to them, this is 1980 something or other, mid-80s. And he says to them, doctors? You're all doctors? I said, yes. Where were you? 1945. Camp after camp. Prison after prison. Hundreds of thousands of people are starving. Why didn't you come? What were you thinking? If there were enough army doctors who knew about nutrition? Where were you? And then I go back to my own experience and I think about it. Sure enough, in Bergen-Belsen, the doctors didn't come from Britain. And they didn't come from Canada. And if, you know who came? Medical students. Leave it to the young to be selfless. Leave it to the young to be prepared to sacrifice. Leave it to the young to say, we got to do this. You know who saved the children in France? Answer, social workers. How old were the social workers? The age of seniors in college. How old was Mrs. Heminger? Whatever her name is, Heminger. She was in her late 20s. I mean, that's who comes. But he looked at these doctors with nothing but contempt, and in his soft tones, filled with outrage, saying, where were you? How did you do it, Judith? Elie speaking. How did you tame us? Nini, that young, beautiful, and devoted teacher of whom you speak so highly, how did she put up with us for so many weeks? I regret our behavior. I am embarrassed about it now. We were hard on you. We made it hard for you to find the path the possibility of understanding yourselves and us. I often dream of the months and years we lived at the children's home of the Oze. The first Shabbat meals, the walks, the campfires, the songs, the talks. I will never forget the grand festivals at Ambloy, reciting Kaddish together, the fast on Yom Kippur, the joy, at first forced then genuine, of Simchat Torah. I am sure that you recall all of it well, Judith. The beginnings, the tears, the letters, the dreams, the nightmares. We were all haunted by the same desire to win the wager. Moshe Ber, Menashe, Kalman, Binim, Glick. One day I too will try to relate in my own way all those stories which link us to yours. And do you remember Shushani? The Talmud lessons, the stormy debates? Was it necessary to initiate us into modern life? Did we have to leave Earth a saint or rejoin a cousin in Brooklyn? I remember my first class report, the ghetto, danger or temptation. I pronounced it in Yiddish. Andre Bodner advised me the design, do not forget the design. The choral group, Elie Wiesel loved to sing and led a choral group in France pretty much as he got there. The choral group, I also remember the choral, intimidated by the children I directed, I had to feign violence in order to maintain my status. Each recital cost me nights of insomnia. I lacked self-assurance and authority. I could not turn away any boy or girl who wanted to sing with us, even if he or she sang badly. Moreover, I could not address myself to a girl chorister without lowering my eyes. All the girls were attractive and inaccessible. I must have appeared stupid. I realized it, but now I understand that you, the instructors, also had obstacles to surmount, problems to solve. Educating a group like ours with such peculiarities and obsessions was not easy. Lacking guidelines probably made it even harder. He goes on and on. Really, Judith, we were condemned to live cloistered lives like those against the wall. Yet in a short time, we succeeded in recovering our directions. How does one explain this miracle? To whom or what does one attribute it to? To our religious affinity? To yours? The fact is that all the children could have easily opted for violence or nihilism, but you directed us toward confidence and reconciliation. You supported and encouraged us to put in the future and the community. Your book demonstrates this. I love what you say about their family lives, the spouse of this one, the children of another. I have kept in touch with a few of them. We often recall the time we spent at Ambloy and Taverny. We speak of you, Judith, and Nina, and the other instructors. When I meet former members at the homes during my trips, I take them aside and we talk and talk. I am happy that you wrote this book, Judith. It is a grave and upsetting matter. Nevertheless, it makes me laugh now and then. I hope you know what role you have played in our existence. Elie Wiesel. I'm going to end with a piece from my own book, in which he's there. And there's no question but that my biggest coach in writing this was Elie. Never told me what to write or how to write or anything of the sort. But he did push me. Did we get another chapter this month, Polak? Where are we holding, you know? And I fought like a dog when I wrote my own book, not to get his voice into what I was saying. Partly because I loved him, and partly because, you know, he writes his own stuff, and I have to write my stuff. And this last chapter that I'm going to read to you, it's not long, was written about 9 years ago. It was published in Commentary magazine, and I knew it would be the last chapter in the book. And I'm going to read it to you because you can hear, I've failed, because you can hear his voice in the lines. It could have been written by him. And I think that in some ways his greatest gift to us was his voice. A voice that knew when to be serious and when not. A man who loved laughter, hated mushrooms, and who was so much in the world. And that's what helped us to mourn. So this is called The Last Witness. Imagine it. The end of an era. The last person able to testify to all that transpired, to all that befell us. The last person who could affirm that we indeed saw what we saw is gone. Of all the rememberers, I alone am left to sit here, knowing that my time will also come. And then, what becomes of the tale? I am limited in what I remember. I was not yet 3 when the war ended. What value is there in the few horrific scenes I can conjure? The historical record is not enriched by them. My memory has become a datum, a relic, valid but not essential. While they still lived, I stood among the other survivors, seasoned, wizened old men and women who were perpetually old, prematurely gaunt. Their bodies reflected those days. The deep shadows of what they had once taken in never left them. They would glance at me in passing, surveying my inconsequentiality, often with patience, often without. I was a fly. Do you really know, child? They would ask. Do you really know what it is to have your parents shot before your eyes? Do you really know what it is to have your grandparents thrown out of the upstairs windows during a liquidation? Did I know? I would put my hands in my pockets and shrug, looking in those early days for a cigarette. Did I know? Question was an accusation. You do not understand, they were saying. You were too young to make sense of it. The carnage and death, the murder by fever and by hunger, all of which I witnessed, some of which I experienced, were not valid to them because I could not have made sense of such experiences as they occurred. My testimony was that of a blind man. I heard the noises, put it all together later, not acceptable in a court of law, not sufficiently real. You say you were there, they argued, but you really weren't. Then they would appear astonished at the pain that came over my face from such invalidation and would hastily take pity. Bis gewähne Jüngele, they would say. It's not your fault. You were just a kid. Children, they meant, are frivolous. Let's not take their experiences seriously. They're all gone now. Their hoary heads and Polish teeth have crossed the great divide. And I alone am left to tell the tale. I'm a bit of a fake, don't you think? A bit of a liar, no? When those memories I did possess would beckon, I trembled. Sleepless nights would become my lot, filled with chills and despair. They were without solace, without consolation. I would not allow love Love promised that what little memory I did have would be submerged. Love meant that the cesspool that was Bergen-Belsen would disappear. When I was 10 years old, my father murdered, my mother married a man in Montreal who forbade mention of the Holocaust. Shall we let it disappear, I wondered. And if we did, would I continue being? I lived with him, but I did not take up with him. I could not remember what brought on my nocturnal fits of madness. There were no visual scenes in my imagination when primordial terrors racked my body. I could not remember why I would periodically get mammoth rheumatic tremors that seized me in the darkness and in the light. I did not remember why mother's moans of terror shuddered within me decades after she died. I knew what I was afraid of, not for what she had been, but for what she had become. I knew that I did not want to have the toughness in her that allowed her to survive. Yet did it enter me. Yet does it overtake me. It turns people away when they sense it. I am not easy to love. For all that, I did not visit my past, really never gave it a glance, until I turned 50. Slowly, I stared at it. Slowly, with index cards, I put it in chronological order. The Hague, Westerbork, Bergen-Belsen, The Hague. Soon after the end of the Holocaust in Montreal, I fell in with other child survivors. They made up fully a third of my 7th grade class. We were silent about our past. When the topic came up, we would become restless and look about anxiously for distraction. We did not want to be witnesses. We just wanted to be like everybody else. Eventually, we each became an anti-witness. We didn't want to hear about it, talk about it. We pretended that the ordeal happened to others, to those who did have numbers on their arms. Perhaps we understood that the mature survivors constituted the most humiliated group of people on earth, and we wanted no part of their residual shame. Mother died when I turned 40. Freddie, a tad older than I, friend, came to sit with me at her shiva. Do you remember Joseph? He said. He's still alive and well. Do you remember how we used to play hide and seek around the corpses in Bergen-Belsen? I did not remember. But it was this question coming from him that allowed me to accept myself as a survivor. And it has taken nearly 3 decades following that Shiva for me to have learned that what my mind does not remember, my body does, and so does my soul. Hesitantly, I take my place among the survivors. I get into the line at the gates of the death camps, and I am there more in death than in life. And so I sometimes entertain this fantasy that because of my sheer youth during those years, I am the last witness. The Holocaust will pass out of experience and into history. There will be no one left to say, and they took my parents away and I never saw them again, or Moishala died in my arms. He had not eaten anything in 2 weeks and his 9-year-old frame could not take it anymore, or my high school teacher examined all the boys in the class and all the circumcised ones were expelled. I carry this fear that when I disappear, so will the last memories of that great darkness, so will the fecal stench that attended the typhus, So will the ravages of the outdoors that attended the roll calls and the stiffness everywhere of the corpses. And in the absence of such primary memories, how long will it take for a civilized country again to allow a leader into office who harbors evil beliefs and insidious desires? And how long until the physicians and lawyers and judges and philosophers and writers and musicians and composers and conductors join his cause? I wonder if I indeed turn out to be the last witness, will my death mark the beginning of the great forgetting? At such moments, fortunately, I have also come to realize the arrogance of such questions and to understand that such arrogance is where idolatry and atheism begin. For I will not be the last witness. The last witness will be the greatest, the most humiliated witness of all. I speak, of course, of God himself. He who is everywhere had to have been there too. He had to have been present, and he had to have witnessed his reputation as Redeemer and Savior of Israel sink into the mud of Treblinka and Belzec. What will the Egyptians say, Moses asks, when God threatens to destroy Israel after they worship the golden calf? Do you want them to say that you took the Jews out of Egypt only so that you might destroy them yourself when they reached the desert? The argument worked. He was averse to being misconstrued. There is a scene in the great Rolf Hochhuth play, The Deputy, in which a priest asks the character Hochhuth, based on Joseph Mengele, something along the lines of, "Have you no fear of divine retribution? Do you not believe that God will call you to account for this?" And Mengele is made to answer, "You have no idea how I wish with all my heart that he strike me down, that he slay me every time I send a child to the gas. But he doesn't." No one came out of the Holocaust looking worse than God. He is compassionate, the theologians used to say. He hates evil, they claimed. Omnipotent, they said. Caring for his chosen people, the liturgy reads. Ha'oneh la'amo Yisrael be'et shavam elav, he who answers the prayer of his people when they turn to him. Not this time. Not 6 million times. Yet although he did not save 6 million of his people, in an extraordinary reversal of roles in history, his people, the ones who did survive, saved him. The rabbis who escaped the infernos spent scant time contemplating, much less bemoaning, what the philosopher Martin Buber has called the eclipse of God. The last witness will join the legions of witness in the celestial palace that is touted as the place where Elijah, in God's presence, will provide the mighty answers, including one that deals with the great absence, while 1.5 million Jewish children were being murdered. 2 lines will form in heaven, each of them silent. No one will ask Elijah a thing. The first line, with Dostoevsky as its guide, might say, Elijah, tell God that we really have no interest in post facto explanations about his great absence. It's just too late for explanations. Too much injustice, too much cruelty has been allowed to happen. The notion of an adequate answer to such horror is itself repulsive. The second line, forming the dialectic, would be Abraham would have Abraham as its guide. It might assert, "It was never about us, Elijah. We never sought and still don't need explanations. It was always about God. We just couldn't bear his vast humiliation, and we did what we could to mitigate it. Blessed be his name forever and ever." And were I the last witness, I would rage against both camps and ask how dare they remain silent? What self-absorbed luxury were they indulging in anyway, when the memory of that time, of those children, is in danger of dissipating? "Where is God?" I would thunder at Elijah. "Is he out there reciting the names of the camps? Belsen, Treblinka, Majdanek, Sobibor? Is he reading the names of the victims?" I would pound the table with both hands. "Is he weeping?" Thank you. So that's an hour answer.
It's an hour question.
It's an hour question. I would recommend that you read second chapter of my book. Second chapter of my book I wrote as a play. The only real thing in there is the Talmudic text that I weave it around, but it is essentially a dialogue between, it's going on in heaven before my soul is sent down to the world. And the Talmud says that we see everything that we're going to experience in the world. So I say, wait a minute, not sure. And that's what the dialogue is about. And I talk about God, and I talk in that chapter about where he is. And I have a line in there that I took out because it's too much chutzpah, even for me. And the line that I took out is, where is God? Well, he's in rehab. But I withdrew it. I like most people like me, have a great fear of God. And the fear of God is part of my religious being, and I have to be very careful about what I say, and what I don't say, and I'm not letting him off the hook. That's what I'm not doing. But what I say and how I say it, I dislike what he did with Job. Like the most dissatisfying book I ever read in my life. It's not an answer. It's not an answer for children. It's not an answer for children. And read the chapter. I should deal with it. Yeah. Elie wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times that I found a little strange. Somewhere in the Sunday Times, he in the 90s, he said, he said, at some point, he says, God and I got divorced. He says, and I want to reconcile. And it was a strange piece. I don't know where it popped out of. He didn't talk to me about it. Because, he told me he never wrote about the Holocaust. And I wrote Night, and that's about it. But he reconciled. And certainly later on in his life, he watched what he was saying more And I may or may not have had something to do with that. But the great rabbis that survived, that were survivors, the real superstars in the Torah world, were not critical of God. They were very careful about what they say. If we're not permitted to say bad things about people, and we're not, true or false, we don't say it. Part of the Jewish tradition. So we're going to say it about God. So there's that. There's that. And it's, I think that the Holocaust survivors, for the most part, have not lost their reverence. That didn't get lost in the Holocaust. And for the other interesting thing about survivors is that there have been 3 studies done. And to everyone's startling surprise, the findings are that if you were a religious Jew before the Holocaust, you were a religious Jew after the Holocaust. That's like 9 out of 10, very consistent finding. But if you were a religious Jew before the Holocaust and started slip-sliding before the Holocaust, then the Holocaust, sealed your questions and your challenges.